Kurt Cobain was halfway through the opening riff of Lithium when he saw them, 3 MTV executives standing in the wings, arms crossed, faces red with anger. One of them, a senior vice president named Amy Finnerty, was making a cutting motion across her throat. "Stop, now." Kurt's fingers paused on the strings for just a fraction of a second. The crowd at the Pauley Pavilion didn't notice. The band kept playing, and then Kurt Cobain did something that would either make him a legend or get Nirvana banned from MTV forever. He looked directly at the cameras and started playing the opening chords to Rape Me. To understand what happened that night in Los Angeles on September 9th, 1992, you need to understand MTV in the early 90s. It wasn't just a music channel. It was the music channel. MTV had the power to make or break careers. One video in heavy rotation could turn an unknown band into superstars overnight. One blacklist could end a career before it started. The executives knew this. The artists knew this. Everyone played by MTV's rules because there was no other game in town. The Video Music Awards were MTV's biggest night of the year. Carefully choreographed, meticulously planned, designed to be provocative. Enough to get people talking, but controlled enough to keep the sponsors happy. Every performance was rehearsed. Every word was approved. Every camera angle was mapped out. Nothing was left to chance. And then there was Nirvana. Kurt Cobain had grown up in Aberdeen, Washington, a dying logging town where the biggest employer was going bankrupt and everyone's parents were getting divorced. He'd slept in hospital waiting rooms, under bridges, in his car. He'd been broke, angry, and ignored by an industry that didn't understand what he was trying to say. But in September 1991, everything changed. Nevermind was released. Smells Like Teen Spirit became the anthem of a generation that didn't even know it needed an anthem. Within months, Nirvana went from playing clubs to selling out arenas. They knocked Michael Jackson off the #1 spot on the Billboard charts. Kurt Cobain became the voice of Generation X whether he wanted to be or not. And he really didn't want to be. By September 1992, Kurt was exhausted, overwhelmed, and deeply uncomfortable with fame. He hated the corporate machinery of the music industry. He hated being packaged and sold. He hated that MTV wanted to turn his pain into entertainment. But MTV loved Nirvana, or more accurately, MTV loved Nirvana's ratings. The network needed them at the VMAs. They needed the credibility that came with having the biggest band in the world on their show. So they invited Nirvana to perform, and that's when the trouble started. 3 weeks before the VMAs, MTV sent their list of demands. They wanted Nirvana to perform Smells Like Teen Spirit. It was their biggest hit, the song everyone wanted to hear. From a television perspective, it made perfect sense. But Kurt refused. "We're not performing that song," he told the band's manager, John Silva. "We've played it 1,000 times. I'm sick of it. Everyone's sick of it." Silva tried to negotiate. "Kurt, it's the VMAs. It's the biggest audience you'll ever have. Tens of millions of people watching live." Kurt didn't hesitate. "Then tens of millions of people can hear something else. We'll play Rape Me." Silva went silent. Rape Me was a song from their upcoming album In Utero. It was confrontational, aggressive, and deliberately uncomfortable. The title alone would send MTV's Standards and Practices department into a panic. "Kurt, they'll never allow it. You know that." Kurt's response was simple. "Then we won't perform." MTV's executives were informed of Kurt's decision. Their response was immediate and unambiguous. Absolutely not. No way in hell would they allow a song called Rape Me to be performed on live television at their biggest event of the year. The sponsors would revolt. The advertisers would pull out. It would be a disaster. They told Silva that Nirvana could perform Lithium instead. It was from Nevermind. It was popular, and most importantly, it was safe. Silva called Kurt with the news. They said no to Rape Me, but they'll let you do Lithium. Kurt was quiet for a moment. Then he asked a question that would change everything. What if we play Lithium, but start with a few bars of Rape Me, just to mess with them? Silva's voice went tense. Kurt, don't, please. They're already nervous about having you on the show. Kurt's response was simple. Good. They should be nervous. On September 8th, the day before the show, Nirvana arrived in Los Angeles for rehearsals. The VMAs were being held at the Pauley Pavilion, a massive arena on the UCLA campus. MTV had transformed the space into a television spectacular with elaborate sets, lighting rigs and cameras everywhere. Nirvana was scheduled to rehearse there, performance at 2 p.m. Kurt showed up 2 hours late, wearing ripped jeans and a t-shirt that said, "Corporate magazines still suck." The MTV production team was already on edge. Dave Grohl, Nirvana's drummer, could feel the tension the moment they walked in. The MTV people were watching us like we were about to burn the place down, he later recalled, and honestly, we might have been. During the sound check, Kurt did exactly what he'd threatened to do. He started playing the opening, Chords to Rape Me. The MTV executives in the control booth immediately started shouting into their headsets. Amy Finnerty came running down from the control booth. Her face was red. Kurt, stop. Stop right now. Kurt kept playing. Dav and Gary Novoselic, the bassist, exchanged glances but kept going. Amy reached the stage. Kurt, I'm serious. You cannot play that song. We had an agreement. Kurt stopped playing and looked down at her. We had an agreement that we'd perform. Nobody said what we'd perform. Amy's jaw tightened. You agreed to play Lithium. That was the deal. Kurt shrugged. Did I? I don't remember agreeing to anything. The tension in the arena was thick. MTV staff members were whispering. Security looked uncertain. Nobody knew what was about to happen. Amy tried a different approach. Her voice softened. Kurt, please. I'm asking you as a friend. Don't do this. You'll get us all fired, and you'll never be on MTV again. Kurt looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled that famous half-smile. Amy, with all due respect, I don't really care about being on MTV. MTV needs us more than we need MTV. It was the truth, and everyone in that arena knew it. Nirvana was the biggest band in the world. MTV needed them to maintain credibility with their audience. But Kurt didn't need MTV. He'd already proven his music could reach millions without their help. Amy stood there, realizing she had no leverage. She couldn't threaten him. She couldn't force him. And she certainly couldn't afford to have them walk out. What do you want, Kurt? Just tell me what you want. Kurt thought about it for a moment. I want to perform the song we want to perform, the way we want to perform it, without a bunch of suits telling us what to do. Amy shook her head. You know I can't let you play Rape Me. But if you promise, really promise that you'll play Lithium tomorrow night, I'll make sure you have creative control over everything else. No interference. Deal? Kurt looked at Dave and Chris. They both shrugged. Deal, Kurt said. But the way he said it made Amy nervous. It was too easy. That night, MTV's senior executives held an emergency meeting. Amy Finnerty was there, along with Doug Herzog, the president of MTV, and several other decision-makers. The mood was tense. We should pull them, one executive said. Put someone else in that slot. Herzog shook his head. We can't pull them now. Half our audience is tuning in to see Kurt Cobain. Amy spoke up. I talked to Kurt. He agreed to play Lithium. I think this was just him testing us during rehearsal. Herzog didn't look convinced. What makes you so sure? Amy hesitated. Because I think he wants to perform, and he knows if he goes too far, we'll have no choice but to cut him. They discussed positioning, security near the stage. If Kurt started playing the wrong song, they'd cut his mic and go to commercial. But Herzog worried about the optics. What happens when every news outlet runs the story about MTV censoring Nirvana? We'll look like corporate censors, which is exactly what he's accusing us of being. After 2 hours of debate, They made their decision. They would let Nirvana perform, but they'd have their finger on the button. If Kurt played even one chord of Rape Me, they'd cut to commercial. It was risky, but keeping Nirvana on the show was worth the risk. September 9th, 1992, the day of the Video Music Awards. The Pauley Pavilion started filling up at 6 p.m. The energy was electric. Backstage was controlled chaos. Performers ran through last-minute rehearsals. The production team went through final checks. Everything was on schedule. Everything except Nirvana. They were supposed to arrive at 6:30. By 7:30, they still hadn't shown up. Amy Finnerty was making frantic calls to John Silva. "Where are they?" The show starts in 90 minutes. At 7:45, a beat-up van pulled up to the backstage entrance. Kurt, Dave, and Chris climbed out, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. MTV staff rushed them inside. They had less than an hour before their performance. In the dressing room, John Silva closed the door. "I need to know right now, are we doing this straight? Are you playing Lithium like you promised?" Kurt looked up. "That's the plan." Silva wasn't satisfied. "That's not an answer, Kurt. Yes or no?" Kurt's expression was unreadable. "I said that's the plan." At 9:05, it was Nirvana's turn. The lights went down. A video package started playing, showing clips from their music videos. The audience erupted. Backstage, a production assistant gave them the signal. "You're up in 30 seconds. Dave took a deep breath. Chris cracked his knuckles. Kurt stared at the floor. The curtain started to rise. They walked onto the stage. The noise from the crowd was deafening. In the wings, Amy Finnerty stood with security guards, her heart pounding. In the control booth, producers had their hands on the equipment, ready to cut audio at the first sign of trouble. Kurt looked out at the audience. He positioned his fingers on the frets. The audience quieted slightly, and then Kurt Cobain started to play. The opening chords rang out through the pavilion, clear, unmistakable. It was Rape Me. In the wings, Amy's face went white. "Cut it!" she screamed. "Cut the audio now!" But before anyone could react, Kurt played exactly 4 bars of Rape Me. 4 bars. And then he transitioned seamlessly into Lithium. The audience erupted. They understood immediately what Kurt had just done. He'd played just enough of the forbidden song to make his point, to show MTV that the power was his, not theirs. And then he'd given them what they'd asked for. It was brilliant. It was provocative. It was pure Kurt Cobain. In the wings, Amy stood frozen, not sure whether to be furious or relieved. In the control booth, producers looked at each other uncertainly. Had that just happened? Nirvana launched into Lithium with an intensity that shook the building. Kurt sang like his life depended on it. Dave pounded his drums with ferocious energy. The performance was raw, powerful, and absolutely electrifying. Halfway through, Kurt started jumping around the stage like a man possessed. He swung his guitar wildly. He threw himself against the amplifiers. This wasn't a polished performance. This was chaos barely contained. This was real, and the audience loved every second of it. As the song built to its climax, Kurt started destroying his equipment. He smashed his guitar into the drum kit repeatedly. Chris threw his bass high into the air, and it came crashing down. And then Kurt did something nobody expected. He climbed to the top of a large speaker stack at the back of the stage. It was at least 15 feet high. Security started moving toward him, but there was no way they could reach him in time. Kurt stood at the top, looking down at 13,000 people. For a moment, everyone thought he was going to jump, and then Kurt simply stepped off backward, falling through the air. Dave's heart stopped. Chris turned white. Amy screamed, but Kurt had calculated it perfectly. He landed on a platform about 8 feet down, rolled, and came up on his feet. The crowd went absolutely insane. It was one of the most punk rock moments in MTV history, and it had happened live on their most corporate show of the year. Nirvana walked off stage to thunderous applause. Backstage, chaos erupted. MTV executives were shouting. Amy Finnerty stood in the middle of it all, not quite believing what had just happened. Kurt walked past her and caught her eye. He gave her that same half-smile from the day before. No words, just that smile that said everything. In their dressing room, the band collapsed onto the couches. "Did that really just happen?" Dave asked, laughing. Chris was shaking his head. "MTV is going to ban us forever." Kurt said nothing. He just sat there with a small smile, looking more content than he'd looked in months. The next day, Nirvana's performance was on the front page of every entertainment section in America. The New York Times analyzed what it meant for the relationship between artists and MTV. Rolling Stone called it the most authentic moment in VMA history. Conservative groups condemned it. MTV's ratings were the highest they'd been in years, and Kurt Cobain had found a way to be both mainstream and rebellious. He'd performed on the biggest stage in music while simultaneously challenging corporate control. But the story didn't end there. What happened that night changed something fundamental in the relationship between MTV and artists. Before that night, MTV held all the power. They controlled which videos got played, which artists got exposure. Artists had to play by MTV's rules or face exile. But Kurt Cobain had shown that it didn't have to be that way. He'd proven that an artist with enough courage could challenge the system and win. MTV needed Nirvana more than Nirvana needed MTV, and everyone now knew it. In the weeks following the VMAs, other artists started pushing back. Pearl Jam refused to make elaborate videos and demanded MTV play their low-budget clips anyway. Rage Against the Machine performed controversial songs and dared MTV to ban them. The balance of power had shifted, largely because of what Kurt did on September 9, 1992. MTV learned they couldn't fully control their talent. Without losing credibility, artists learned they didn't have to surrender their integrity to achieve success. Kurt rarely talked about the performance afterward. When asked, he'd deflect or change the subject. But those close to him said it was one of the few moments when he felt like he'd stayed true to himself. He'd been offered the chance to play it safe, to give the corporation what it wanted. Instead, he'd played those 4 bars of "Rape Me" and reminded everyone watching that he couldn't be controlled. Years later, Dave Grohl reflected on that night. Kurt was always fighting this battle between wanting to reach people with his music and hating the machinery that allowed him to reach them. That night, he found this perfect middle ground. He got to perform for millions, but he did it on his terms. He showed MTV they didn't own him. Chris Novoselic had a similar take. Kurt couldn't stand anyone having power over him, especially corporate executives. That night, he took the power back, even if it was just for a few minutes. He showed that the artist is more important than the corporation. MTV never officially banned Nirvana. They continued to play their videos in heavy rotation, but the relationship was never the same. There was a wariness on both sides. MTV knew they couldn't fully trust Nirvana, and Nirvana knew MTV would always try to control them if given the chance. When Kurt died in April 1994, MTV dedicated hours of programming to him. They showed clips from that 1992 VMA performance, where a young Kurt Cobain had stood on that stage and reminded the world that some things matter more than playing it safe. The 4 bars of "Rape Me" that Kurt played lasted maybe 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds represented something larger. They represented the refusal to be commodified, the rejection of corporate control, the insistence that art matters more than commerce. In those 10 seconds, Kurt Cobain showed a generation of musicians that it was possible to be successful without selling out, that you could play the game without letting the game change who you were. That's the real story of the night MTV tried to silence Kurt Cobain. No dramatic escape, no violent confrontation, just one artist with a guitar making a choice. The choice to play 4 bars of a forbidden song. The choice to challenge authority even when it would have been easier to comply. The choice to be authentically himself, even on the most corporate stage in music. And in making that choice, Kurt Cobain changed rock history. He showed that the artist's voice matters more than the corporation's rules. He proved that integrity doesn't have to be sacrificed for success. MTV wanted Kurt Cobain to perform Smells Like Teen Spirit. Safe, predictable, profitable. Instead, they got 4 bars of Rape Me, followed by one of the most intense performances in VMA history. They got chaos. They got authenticity. They got exactly what made Nirvana matter. And Kurt Cobain became a legend, not just for his art, but for his courage. The courage to play those 4 bars. The courage to stand up to the most powerful force in music. The courage to stay true to himself when it would have been so much easier to just play along. That's what happened on September 9th, 1992. That's the night Kurt Cobain's response changed rock history forever.